every time we say goodbye, my dear. I don't know why it's so unclear. Your mouth says go away, but your body's telling me to stay.
Hello everybody and welcome to There and Then. I'm your host, Tom Gutteridge. This is a podcast where we look at the works of one Canadian author, namely my grandfather, Don Gutteridge, and find out what inspires him, what inspired him to write, and to put his work into the broader context of the wide world of CanLit as a whole. The idea here isn't to dissect or microanalyze the work. It's more about spending some time enjoying the work and spending some time together. Today we're going to be discussing a book that's very important to Grandpa. It's a novel called Lily's Story. Now, Grandpa views this as his magnum opus. Lily's Story is a very long book, and it is very worth reading. Basically, and we'll get into more details about this, but Lily's Story follows the life of a woman named Lily, shocker, born in 1840, and it follows 77 years of her 80-year life. Now, the book is set in Point Edward, our old friend Point Edward. And it's another example of Grandpa finding some meaning and finding some purpose in that town that was so important to him. Now, Lily's a fictional character, but she interacts with a lot of real historical figures, and this is sort of where the seed germinated for Grandpa, it seems, in his interest in historical fiction. And we're going to discuss all of this at length, but it's important to understand that we're talking about a fictional story, but it's got a strong grounding in reality. Lily's Story was first published right around the time I was born, but it's one that's had a long and tumultuous history of publication and lack thereof. I think it's a source of frustration for Grandpa that it wasn't that it wasn't picked up by a bigger publisher, because he truly feels this is one of his best works, and when you read it, I think you'll understand why. Now, Lily's Story is available in both ebook and print format. We go into this in our discussion. But it is out there if you are interested, and I'll provide some links on the website. Well, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Don.
But you stop me saying no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Welcome, everybody. I'm here again with my grandfather, Don Gutteridge. How are you, Grandpa?
I'm fine today, thanks, Tom.
Great. Well, I'm very happy to be here. Today we are going to be talking about a book that is called Lily's Story. It's gone by a few names over the years. Grandpa was just telling me. It was initially called Lily Fairchild?
No, that's the revised version of it. It's called Lily's Fairchild.
Okay.
The first volume was called St. Vitus Dance.
Yep.
And the second volume was called Shaman's Ground.
Oh, okay.
And they appear in the final published edition as parts book 1 and book 2.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So, we talked a little about this, and I gave a bit of an intro to the book in my introduction, but basically, to summarize, Lily's Story is a work of historical fiction dealing with the life of a woman born in, it is Lambton County, correct? Mm-hmm. Is it 1845 her story picks up?
She's 5 years old, born in 1840. It starts in 1845.
Yeah, and it traces about 70 years of her life?
It goes from basically 1840 to 1922, so 82 years.
Yeah.
And I deal with 77 of those 82.
Yep. Well, and as far as your books go, this has to be the longest by far.
Oh, by far, yes. In fact, the things like Bus Ride and All in Good Time and How the World Began are fairly mid-sized or short novels.
Yeah, and this one is epic in scale compared to those ones.
Yeah, it just grew like Topsy.
Yeah, that was sort of, and I do want to sort of touch on that. Now, first of all, was this your first foray into historical fiction?
In a way, Bus Ride, set back in the war, would technically be classified as historical fiction, and All in Good Time is also set during the Second World War.
Right.
But this is my first time in going really back into true historical fiction.
And it sort of it picks up in, I guess, what you would call the late rebellion period. Is that the rebellion period? Is that what we call it?
The rebellion period is over by 1840.
Okay. So, because that in later years has become more of a focus of yours.
In the Mark Edwards mysteries,
with
right?
the Edwards mysteries, but
Yeah.
this is a time that you haven't really touched on in your work before this.
No, it wasn't, and I can't remember back to the germ that got it started.
Yeah.
All I knew was I wanted to write a novel from a woman's point of view.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested in history and the urge to write because of, the early poetry is historical. And so I've always had that urge. I took a minor in history in university, and I've been interested in it all my life.
Yeah. So, what year did you start working on Lily's story?
I think it was 83 or 84.
Okay. And how long did it take you to finish it?
About 2 years.
Yeah. Were you working on anything else, or was that your main focus?
Well, of course, I was teaching, but one of those years was a sabbatical year, so I had a full year at it.
Okay.
And the various time I could take out from my academic career, yes.
Right. This would be, of course, just to provide a bit of context, this would be the very same window when I came into existence.
Exactly.
So, right, you were working on Lily's story right around the time I was born.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And so just to put it in sort of a timeline of your other work, you hadn't gone back into writing poetry yet.
No. In fact, the only book of poetry I had published after the God's Geography was my collected narratives, The Exiled Heart, in 1986. And that I was kind of glad that came out then, and that I talked the publisher into doing a selected narratives,
right?
Because I hadn't been doing any poetry, and I was feeling vaguely guilty that I was writing only prose instead of poetry.
Yeah.
So I really didn't get back to. I wrote How the World Began in the late either 90 or 91, and I really didn't start poetry until Love in the Wintertime in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And that was a very thin little book.
Yeah, so when you were writing this book, you say you don't really remember what sparked it. Was there anything, it was just a motivation that sort of came out of the blue?
Yes, it was. Came straight out of the blue.
Yeah.
And what I started doing, as I usually do, I started to write to see if I had anything. It's hard to explain, but what I do is I write a few paragraphs to see if I've got a voice and I've got something that's worth continuing. And that first section in the book is really quite poetic. And I thought, I've actually got the voice of a 5-year-old. It's working.
Yeah.
And so I simply started to keep on going once it started working. And then, of course, I realized that while I was working on her childhood, I could totally invent it. But if it was going to continue on, I had to do some research.
Yes.
So I started reading some of those books that you see in the bibliography, the history of the time, the social history of the time, and all of that sort of thing.
Yes.
And then the history of the railroads came into it. The history of the oil wells came into it. But what I would do would be I would write, and then when I needed the research, then I would read. That's the way I've done all of my work. Same with the mythic narratives. I would read, write,
Yep.
back and forth, instead of doing it all at once and then all at once. That's the way I've patterned almost all of my stuff. And what it means is that you're taking a great risk that there's something there to go to.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So during this process, was it from the beginning that you knew you were going to set this character's life in Lambton County?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I really, as I went along, and I got her up to Sarnia when her father sort of abandoned her.
Yep.
Then I thought, well, Sarnia is only 10 years away from Point Edward being started.
Yes.
The earliest references to Point Edward are in the late 60s. And I thought, I'm going to write, at some point, I said to myself, I'm going to write the story of Point Edward and Lily together. And from that point on, it's really a history of the early development of Point Edward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like a lot of your Point Edward work, it is focused on Point Edward while it doesn't seem like its goal is to explicitly go over the history.
Exactly.
But rather sort of weave it in with the narrative you're exploring.
Yeah, and one reviewer thought I didn't get the balance right, and another reviewer thought I had the balance perfect between the personal and the historical.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah. There's another, one of the other things there's a couple of main themes in Lily's story about that sort of historical period. One would be transport, so the idea of the shipping lanes, the railroad going in, the idea that, was it the Grand Trunk Railroad? The Grand Trunk Northern?
Yeah. Went right through Point Edward, and it's the railhead was there.
Yep.
And there's a scene later on in the book of them taking cattle across on barges.
Yes.
And they also took them across. They also put the rail cars, the cattle cars, on barges. And there was a link, a chain that went across the entire river at Point Edward, and they put the cattle cars on barges, and then they kind of shuffled it across. So
that would have been prior to the tunnel.
The tunnel is 1892 or 3, and that comes into it as well.
Yeah, it's another the tunnel, and then you stop short. It pulls up before you got the Blue Water Bridge.
Yeah, that's 1937. That's
so
right.
It's a 20 years or so after the story.
That's right.
That's one of the things I found striking about Lily's story was it really is a novel about modernity at times. Coming to a place that is, Lily's world right at the beginning of the novel is it's barely rural. It's almost like wilderness at the start.
Oh gosh, yes, definitely.
And then you sort of see a transition into early agricultural Canada.
Right.
And then a switch towards sort of early pre-modern industrial Canada towards the end.
With the discovery of oil and the beginning of cottage industries in and around Point Edward. In fact, the fields where we used to play as children were covered with small factories, including an oil refinery.
Now, It's actually an interesting thing that not a lot of people, even from here, let alone whoever else may be within the sound of our voice, it's not well known, but there actually was and is oil present in southwestern Ontario.
Oh, yes, in and around Petrolia and Oil Springs. They're still pumping oil.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this was something I never knew, and then I recall we went to Oil Springs and Petrolia when I was
to
young.
The museum, yes.
Is that the place where they had that huge ball of, I don't know what it was, but it was some sort of petroleum product that was about 5 feet square, and I just remember it being burning hot because it was the summer.
Well, the oil there is what we call heavy crude.
Yep.
And it couldn't be refined in Canada. It was shipped by rail to some place in Michigan where they could refine it into more usable products.
Yeah.
But it was a heavy black, and what we saw there was probably the tar from the oil that they made into was it a square or a ball?
I think it was a ball, if I'm not mistaken, because I think I remember trying to sit on it, but it was a hot summer day and the thing was burning hot.
Yeah.
That is a sense memory from my childhood, but I was blown away by the fact that we actually had petroleum here.
Yeah.
And so those are, how far are Petrolia and Oil Springs from Point Edward?
I would say probably 25 miles at the most.
And you said that there were, like, you're talking about micro manufacturing / processing, like these would be small factories processing.
Oh yeah, tiny little ones. Yeah, they were everywhere.
That's fascinating. That's something I don't think about when I think about.
There were quite a number here in London.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
In East London, there were oil refineries.
Now, is that where they got that coal tar that ended up in the river? Down the forks of the Thames there?
Oh, that's probably right. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, I just thought about that coal tar resin they found in the Thames.
And then, of course, I discovered when I wanted to do the discovery of oil, and this is the way the mind works when you're writing fiction. I thought, well, I'll have Lily and Tom honeymoon in Oil Springs because it was a boom town.
Yeah.
There were over 3,000 people in Oil Springs.
Really?
It had a main street with a boardwalk. It had sidewalks.
Yeah.
It had 3 saloons.
Yeah.
2 bordellos. And so I described Lily and Tom taking a coach ride down this
down the main drag of Oil Springs.
The plank road. And but that's how I work. I weave the personal into the historical. I was astounded when I found this tiny little pamphlet in the Western Library on Oil Springs. I couldn't believe my luck.
Oh yeah, and so this was primary source stuff you managed to find?
Primary source stuff, yeah.
Well, that is a lucky find.
Very few people know about it. I mean, it's. I mean, I've been to Oil City and Oil Springs when I was a kid because we had relatives out there, and nobody ever talked about those old days. They couldn't remember them because the town simply disappeared, and everything was of wood. Nothing lasted. There was nothing left.
Oh, so it was almost sort of almost a ghost town.
It came and then it turned into a ghost town. Yeah, completely disappeared.
Yeah.
There's a tiny little hamlet there now with a gas station and a general store.
Yeah, and then I think over in Petrolia they've got a museum.
Yeah, Petrolia, of course, pretends that it had all of the oil, but it was actually Oil Springs.
Yep.
And another little place called Oil City, which is still
and
there.
because Petrolia is around to tell the tale. I mean, this was, of course, a fascinating part of the book because I remember peripherally going there when I was young, but it's not something that is at the forefront of people's memory when it comes to early modern Ontario.
Right.
Now, the other thing I thought was great about Lily's story is, of course, it blends, the transition to modernity, the transition to modern transport, and then it also has the sort of the advent of sort of early Upper Canada politics is a huge is a thread that goes through, and I think there's about 3 times in the book where she interacts with named politicians. Was that something you initially thought would be part of it, or did it just sort of become part of it?
That just came along because I got around 1970 when she was burned out of her house and was settled in Point Edward, and with Sophie, and then near Sophie, and so on. And no, I thought there was an election in 1870.
Yes, there was.
I wonder if I could use that. And then again, I read. So I read the biography of John A. Macdonald to see if I could get any material. And there was a section in there describing a trip he took, an election trip that he took by steamer to Gutteridge.
Huh.
And then from Gutteridge, they came down to Point Edward and docked there overnight.
Really?
And then he gave a speech the next day. And a very famous speech, in which he was viciously attacked, and when he tried to speak, he vomited. And this is described in the local paper in great detail.
Well, and this is what I meant to ask you. This is a real event? This happened?
Oh, yes, it did.
That is impressive.
Yeah,
and
I couldn't believe my luck.
Yeah, I mean, just talk about having a ready-made scene
of course,
handed to you.
As you know from my other works, I cull these books for these kinds of stories. I have an eye for them, and as soon as I see them, I say, I'm going to use that one. And then I thought, well, he stayed overnight, and he was a notorious drinker. This was one of his worst drinking periods, because he was going through the railroad scandal, which hadn't quite broken yet.
Yes.
And so I had him sneak off the ship and go looking for a drink. And he found Lily.
Yes.
And they had a conversation in which he goes on and on about people voting, and she says, I don't vote. I'm a woman. That's the end of that episode.
Yeah, well, I guess this is one of the things that you moved into in the Mark Edwards mysteries a lot, which is having your character interact with these real figures from Canadian history.
Right.
Do you have a process for how you write these people, or do you just try and...
I read their biographies.
Yeah?
Yeah. I read a lot for the Mark Edwards as well.
Because Sir John A. is, of course, very well known. He's, a towering figure in our history. There's more minor ones you find later.
Yeah.
But this is a good example of what I would call I don't know. I'm trying to think of a word for it. You're sort of playing with these characters in a way.
Oh yeah.
Because I feel like you're trying to be historically accurate while still bringing a little bit of the humor to it as well.
Yeah, because it's a dark book. Anytime I could use Sophie or any one of the other characters for a little humor, I put it in.
Yeah, the sort of, I guess, the related topic is the idea of this family developing over a period of 70 years.
Yeah.
Did you have a sense of where the arc was going? Or did you just sort of write through it and end up where you ended up?
I wrote through it decade by decade.
Yeah.
And as the wars came along, I had the boys become involved in the war. Tom initially, and then the boys in the war, because it's basically an anti-war novel.
Yes.
Among other things, she certainly it's about, I would say, the relationship of an individual relatively powerless in the hands of historical event. That's the way I would sort of summarize the book.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent way to summarize it. Do you feel like, were you expressing a way you felt through this novel?
Oh yes, very much. Once I got into the character of Lily, I just saw everything that happened to her and for her through her eyes.
Yeah.
And I mean, what's amazing is that it's a long novel. It's 286,000 words.
Yes.
Which is about the length of David Copperfield. And
just a little bit south of War and Peace.
Yeah, just a little south of War and Peace.
Yep.
And at one point I knew of course, you're always thinking about how you're going to end it, because
Yes.
it was kind of one thing to go through decade by decade, and I got the railroads, and I got the wars, and I got the tunnel. The tunnel practically destroyed Point Edward.
Yeah.
Because there's a description of the people taking their houses down, putting them on wagons, and taking them to Sarnia and setting them up
Yes.
near the tunnel.
Yes, I do remember that part.
Yeah.
They sort of pulled up stakes in the early town and headed over towards the tunnel.
Yeah, it's headed towards the tunnel.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what happened was that the switching yards then moved. With the tunnel, you didn't need the railhead, and so the 27 switching yards, which was where we flew our kites,
Yes.
were all moved to Sarnia.
Yep.
And Sarnia became the terminus of the combined railroad when the Great Western and the Grand Trunk joined to become the CNR in 1910. And that's why people don't realize why we have two routes to Toronto.
Yeah.
And that's because one was the Great Western and the other was the GTR route. The one through Kitchener and St. Mary's is the old GTR route.
Yes.
And that ended in Point Edward.
Oh.
And the Great Western ended in Sarnia.
Okay.
And it came through London. Brantford and London.
I have always wondered that, and I did.
Yeah, why do we have two separate routes to Toronto?
There's that the northern route and the more southerly route, and they were the two main rail. Okay.
They were the two, and they were rivals. They were both competing with one another to bring things to the American market.
It's fascinating when I start thinking about these sort of places. It's almost like you're building the scaffolding that you then set Summer's Idol and things against. It's almost like you're laying the groundwork of that town earlier than I'm used to thinking about it.
Yeah.
Because I mainly think about Point Edward in the context of your life, so from the 40s on.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see what went into making that town.
Yeah. Well, getting back to how I ended it, which I started a while ago.
Yeah.
At some point, probably around the time I was doing the tunnel, and I realized she was getting well on, and I thought I'm going to end it with the monument, with the raising of the war monument in 1922, rather than her death. And then, in order to give it somewhat of a brighter ending, I added Arthur Coote as a character, and her, even though they lived in a shack, which I'll show you where it was when we go up there.
Yeah.
I tried to give it a slightly brighter tone at the end, and then of course the big plot shift when the granddaughter returns.
Yes.
And you have a circular motion. So I felt particularly good about that when I thought of it. I thought, it's really going to be hard to end this long saga. I could have her drop dead, but I wanted to give it a more circular motion, because that's somewhat what I believe in life, that there are kind of circular patterns to life that come and go. And the whole book is a large, big circle.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because the one thing I feel about Lily's story upon reading it again, so I think I've probably read it twice in full and a couple times in part, but there certainly are larger and smaller cycles in this book. It's a prominent feature of the book, and that's one of the things that I found satisfying about the ending, was that a book like that, the trope would be that it ends with the death of the protagonist.
Yeah.
It's a little like what is that? The Stone Angel?
Yeah.
Where the Stone Angel, that's one of the things that I didn't like about a book that's otherwise, it's people consider The Stone Angel a classic. I thought it was all right. But the ending, which is presumably the death of the protagonist, is deeply unsatisfying.
Yeah, that's right.
So this book was a process that took over 2 years to write.
Mm-hmm.
It has sort of an interesting publication history, too. Again, I gave a little bit of an outline of this, but do you mind running me through how this came to be a published work?
Of course, I published it myself in 2 volumes, and I sold a couple hundred copies, which was really quite good in those days. You wouldn't do that again today with all the e-books and that on the internet, but there wasn't that much literature being published, and I got a lot of library orders. The book got into many, many libraries across the country, which is what my goal was at that time.
Yeah.
So nothing happened. I wrote other books, and I wrote academic books, and I started writing mysteries, and I got them all written. And then I was involved with Beverly Slope and my agent over the mystery books. And I said to her, just as a whim one day, I said, I wonder if it's been a while, if you would take on Lily's story again.
Yes.
And she says, I'll publish it myself. And that's how that came about. I had just on a whim thought, I wonder if enough time has gone by if she could try and sell it again. And she said to me, it's too long. Nobody will look at it. And she said, so I'll do it myself.
Yep.
And so she did it as an e-book, and then I arranged it for the paperback version, but it has her imprimatur on it.
Right.
And that's how that came about.
So it was written, finished in 86. When was the first publication by Bev Editions?
I finished writing it about 85 and got around to actually getting it typed up. I had to have, in those days, I had the initial version, St. Vitus Dance,
right,
was typed on a regular typewriter.
Yeah.
and the second version, by then, they had computers at our college, so the second version has a computer printout.
Right.
So the first version is pretty rough because it looks like a very poor typewritten version.
That's pre-word processing.
It's pre-word processing, yeah.
Right.
How the world has changed for the better, eh?
Yeah. And so the most recent edition, so the copy of Lily's story I have here,
2014, I believe.
2014. So this is a book that I don't want to say languished, but just sort of hung around for a long time before you managed.
It really did. And it was just because I was so busy with my other work that I just never got around to thinking about it. But the last mystery books were published around, I think, 2012, and then I was publishing poetry at that time, but then I looked back at my novels and I thought, well, I'll just give this one more try. Why not? I've got an agent this time who was really interested in my work.
Yeah.
And then she said, I'll take it if you will cut it. So I cut out 60,000 words.
Yeah.
And we renamed it Lily Fairchild.
Okay.
And she has now spent 15 months, and she has been unable to find anybody to publish it. We've got some wonderful letters back from publishers. One of them said, this is a book that should be published, but they won't do it because it's too long, even at 225,000 words.
Yeah, so the original version, which was St. Vitus Dance and Shaman's Ground, then became the full unabridged Lily's story, which has now been abridged to Lily Fairchild.
Which has now been abridged to Lily Fairchild. So it's had quite a history. But no, I don't think we'll ever see Lily Fairchild. But I'm delighted that the other paperback, and especially the e-book, has still been selling regularly.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, it's of course a good novel. I think it's great, but it's also it touches on issues people want to read about. It just is sort of hard to find a market for this kind of thing now.
Yeah, it really is. Well, probably 40 years ago, 35 years ago, I would have found a publisher because people like Jack McClelland, who ran McClelland Stewart, they published books if they were good. So quality was their first. Then they worried about selling them. And of course, Jack went broke twice. Had to be bailed out by the Ontario government. But
right.
It was a different era back then. There were no agents. You just sent your work in, and it got read.
Yep.
And if it was of good quality, they would have published it.
Yep.
And I think I probably 35 years ago, I would have found a publisher for it.
I imagine you would have, because the things that I find interesting about it are, it's a novel that, while set in the past, is very progressive in its sensibilities, and I think it plays well in a market today where people are being more progressive about the role of women and acknowledging the hardships that they had in a previous time.
Right.
In a way, I see it as somewhat of a, it's somewhat feminist in its outlook, in that it's very empowering for the females in the book, but they're subjected to such unfair treatment. Yeah, it can be hard sometimes to really read it.
I've sort of thought about that, and I'm thinking, I was concerned that really modern feminism would find it, the fact that she was so pushed down that it wouldn't be inspiring enough to young feminist readers. It's not upbeat enough, but it's her gumption, her struggle to survive, especially with the kind of men that she was surrounded by, and mistreated by, and of course the historical record. I mean, the 19th century was not kind to women.
No, it was a very hard place to be, and I think Lily, she's an inspiring character on that front. I think you're right in that, that modern feminist literature, quite often they feel like it does have to be somewhat upbeat, but there's also a more considered readers out there that would want to hear it because it's hard, because it's tough, but because it's true.
Well, it hasn't been reviewed by the mainstream press, but I've got over 24 reviews from friends, associates, and people that my agent has sent it to, and there are about 24 reviews on Goodreads, which gives you an idea that it did strike readers, even though it was long, and none of them complained about it being long. I never had I don't think in any of those 24 reviews anybody says it's too long.
Well, and that's the thing, right? That's kind of one of the nice things about these days is, it might be print media is becoming less and less marketable and becoming more and more about profit. But one of the nice things about today is that people that are still into books are still into books. They'll read things that are good. Yeah. But it's getting it out there through the standard system. It can be really hard these days.
Well, as one of my reviewers, I send it to in the United States for independent publishers. There are blog sites that do reviews. You have to pay about $50. Yep. To get reviews, but you get very good reviews by people who just love to read. They're not professional reviewers, but they love to read, and as I say, none of them have ever complained about the length. One of them said, if you're the kind of reader who likes to get into a good long book, this is Lily's Story is for you.
Yeah, well, and it is unabashedly long. Like it really is it's an adventure reading it, but I also think on one level it couldn't be any shorter than it is to cover what it covers.
To cover what it covers, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you think that Dickens wrote about 12 books that long. It's absolutely amazing to think of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to perhaps stretch a connection, I feel like a lot of the characters you create, both in these books and in the Point Edward sort of fictionalized historical portrayals, are almost Dickensian, because there's a lot of very interesting, colorful characters that are also horribly flawed, and and some of what they do makes you horribly sad. But I think overall it's definitely effective. It's engaging. It draws the reader in. I hope more people will read it, because I think it's a book that's worth reading.
Well, I love creating the characters.
Yeah.
And that's really the pleasure I get, is not so much from the narrative or the plot, although that's always a challenge and you're aware of it as you go.
Mm-hmm.
But I kept, as she moved into Mushroom Alley, I thought, I'm going to have to people this alley. I can't just say it's a bit of a slum area and she's moving into it.
Mm-hmm.
So I invented a whole row of them.
Mm-hmm.
They just kept coming. Like the guy, I can't remember his name now, the guy who sits up in the top of a tree and watches the ships coming in.
I can't remember his name either, but that's a character I remember.
And it was his pig that they had the problem with.
Yes.
His boar.
Mm-hmm.
And things like that led to some comic scenes in it as well.
Yeah.
But I haven't, and the same when we get to the historical fiction,
Mm-hmm.
the creation of character has never been an issue. I just think I need a character of this type, and
Mm-hmm.
one of them suddenly appears on the page.
Okay, this is a, I guess, sort of a side note. How do you come up with names for characters?
Isn't that interesting that you would ask that question? Because I think of that quite often. But after I've created the name,
Mm-hmm.
I think it fits.
Yeah.
It just seems to fit. I tell you, one way I did come up with names for the mystery novels. By the time I got to the mystery novels,
Mm-hmm.
I was back in the 1830s,
Yeah.
and I wanted authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the Western Library, and I got a book about the history of early Buffalo.
Oh, okay.
And
yeah.
in the back of it,
Yeah.
it had an appendix with the list of names of people who lived in Buffalo.
Oh, okay.
And I took some of those names straight out of that book.
Well, they were actual names of people from the period.
Yes.
Oh.
Many of them were.
It makes sense. I mean, they do have I guess that's another part that I find sort of Dickens-ish, because his characters have, some of their names are such a mouthful, but
they're wonderful, aren't they?
they're evocative, and I think some of the names in Lily's story fit that bill too. It's definitely a rich tapestry. Well, so the other thing I wanted to ask you about was, this is clearly a work that you have had a lot of time to think about over the years. What do you think sets this book apart from some of your other novels?
It was the most satisfying description of a town and a place and a time that I've always been interested in, and that I've really fallen in love with over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can add some of the smaller books together,
Mm-hmm.
but this one has it all in between two covers.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly has struck me as a passion project over the years.
Yes.
Certainly something that you really love.
Yeah.
And there's a reason you've pushed for it over the years, despite being roadblocked.
I consider it my magnum opus. That's why I pushed to get it somewhere in the public domain, somewhere in libraries and places where people could read it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good.
And of course, the thing about the internet, once it's on there, it's there for future generations. Somebody might pick it up. Who knows when?
Well, one of the tropes of the internet, which often comes as a word of warning, is the internet is forever.
Yeah,
if it is on the internet, it is there forever.
Be warned.
Be warned. But in the case like this, now, Lily's story, there is an ebook available, correct? Is there an ebook of Lily's story available?
Yes.
And that's available through Bev Editions?
Bev Editions published it, but it's available through Amazon.
Yeah.
And Chapters Indigo,
Yep.
Kobo, Barnes and Noble, and Smashwords. There's 4 different sites where you can get the ebook.
That's great. And then, as far as hard copies go, we've all got them. Is there a way for the public to obtain hard copies of Lily's Story?
Yes, Amazon.
You can get them on Amazon as well.
And Chapters Indigo.
Good.
They what it is it's done print on demand.
Ah, okay.
So that there are no copies lying around extant anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But if in fact I've just replaced copies that I gave away.
Yep.
Just recently.
Ah.
And I just go to Amazon, or if I usually start with Chapters, and they actually had a couple of copies.
Yeah.
But Amazon orders it from a large company in the United States that does most of the print on demand for the entire continent, and they have all of these books digital.
Mm-hmm.
They have a huge machine.
Yeah.
They put the digital copy in one end, they press a button, the book comes out the other end, complete.
That blows my mind.
Isn't that amazing?
I didn't even know that was a thing. I did not know that was a thing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And so you're basically ordering up a copy.
You're ordering up a copy, and it comes within 2 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. No, that's amazing.
No, in fact, that's allowed a lot of independent self-publishers to get into the game because they don't have to have stock.
Yeah.
As long as you have somebody willing to buy it, you just simply email this company and they print a copy off.
That is amazing. Well, and I think it certainly fits with the new climate of print media.
Yeah.
People don't want overhead, and
it costs about $15 American for that huge book, Lily's Story.
Really?
Yeah. Now Amazon marks it up. You have to pay about $32 or something for it on Amazon.
Right, because they gotta get a taste too. But this would be first choice books you're talking about.
That should have.
Printed in Canada on recycled paper by First Choice Books.
Yeah, but it has Bev Editions on it, does it not? Yeah.
This one's Bev Editions.
First Choice Books is the one who does it. They did a wonderful job. Imagine having to design the interior of that, all those chapters and getting the pages right. They did an absolutely superb job.
That's amazing. I'm really glad that's out there, because it's nice to know that people can have a print copy if they want it.
Yeah.
And B, it makes me more hopeful for like you say, self-publishers to actually get into the game is got to be a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the thing I'll ask you, which is what I always do, how did it feel to read Lily's Story again?
Absolutely wonderful. I enjoyed it again as much as when I first wrote it.
Yeah.
But of course, it helps to leave a little time between.
Yes.
No, I think it is my best work, although there are lots of little items that are little gems, I think, as well, that I love. And but like the 2 books we're going to talk about in a few weeks.
Yes.
The little memoirs and so on. But of course, in terms of scope and effort and impact, I think Lily's Story probably is it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it certainly is like all of your books. I find it very moving, of course. I find it to be, like I said, I think it's a work that is very progressive in a lot of ways, and I'm glad that people can get it, because I think of all your works, it's one of the ones I think people need to read the most.
Yeah, it's certainly available.
That's great.
And it's also in almost all the major libraries across the country as well, for people who use libraries.
That's great. Well, yeah, and honestly, to anyone within the sound of my voice, I would really encourage you to go on over to Amazon and get yourself an e-copy of Lily's Story. It may take you a couple weeks to read. It will be a couple weeks well spent. Grandpa, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
All right. Well, it's been lovely spending the day with you again, and we'll do it again soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye, Grandpa.
Would you stop me saying no, no, no? I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
As always, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. It was really great to talk to Grandpa about something he's clearly passionate about. That this is a work he loves, and it's one that it's not hard to find things to talk about with him with regards to this book. The story itself is as engaging as ever, and knowing that the author is so passionate about it, I think just makes it that much more of a wonderful work. As Grandpa mentioned, Lily's story is available from Chapters Indigo and as well on Amazon in both ebook and print-to-order hard copy. I would encourage you to pick yourself up a copy. Be prepared. It is a big read. It's a project. It is absolutely worth your time. If you've got any interest in the history of Upper Canada, or just in hearing a really great, empowering story, this would be one I would heartily recommend. Grandpa also has a couple books of poetry out through Black Moss Press. The Blue Flow Below came out this year, and Tidings and Inundations both came out last year, all in print, all available. And you can always just look up Don Gutteridge on Amazon and see what's out there. His books are widely spread, but there are certainly some out there for those that are interested. Special thanks, as always, to Joe Organ and the band Moves for the use of their song A Little Longer for the intro and outro of our podcast. You can find Joe Organ on SoundCloud and Moves on Bandcamp. The album is called Tape. It's from 2013. It's a great album. You should check it out. Moves is a spectacular act. Well, as always, it's been lovely having you. Thank you for joining us on There and Then.
Would you stop me saying no, no, no? I guess I'll stay on by